The subject, Images of Islam in the West, is one of the most serious of all subjects with which one could be concerned, because not only does it have a vast historical dimension covering nearly every field of study, from science to art, from philosophy to law, but also it concerns very much the human condition today, because there are many powerful forces in the world which would like nothing better than to create Islam in an abstract way as the next other, pitted against the West and posing mortal danger to the very existence of the West, and therefore creating a polarization politically, which, to say the least, has a great deal of economic profit for the sale of arms and many other kinds of profit for political machinations and policy making in many regions of the world. And therefore it's a subject which is at once of great historical interest and great political, social interest today. For that very reason, I shall divide my subject into three parts, leading us right up to the present day. And in fact, it was precisely this that Professor Powers asked me to do when we were discussing my program here. But let me begin at the beginning. Islam and the West have had a concordant, parallel, and also divergent history from the moment of the birth of Islam. As it would happen, as Providence would have it if one speaks theologically, not only did Islam grow out of an ambience which in fact was that of original Christianity, namely the Abrahamic world, and not only did it share with Christianity the prophets of the Old Testament, the Hebrew prophets, the God who creates the world and who is one, a theological language which on the deepest level is shared by all the monotheistic religions, but also inherited along with Christianity many of the elements of the Greco-Alexandrian world, which in fact gave rise in the Islamic world to another kind of expression. What we read about all the time in Western sources as Athens and Jerusalem being the twin sources of Western civilization, this statement also to some extent would involve Islam if you extended Jerusalem to that other quotes-unquote Jerusalem, which is Mecca, because according to Islamic tradition, at the end of time when Christ descends, Mecca and Jerusalem will become a single pole again. So symbolic, they represent really the same pole, same center of the Abrahamic world which manifested itself with the rise of Islam. Anyway, the rise of Islam in the 7th Christian century, in the year 610, and to be precise, of the Christian era, marked in fact a rupture in the Christian worldview of itself. Had it been a religion revealed in Tibet or in Jakarta in Indonesia, would have been very different. But it manifested itself within the Eastern world of Christianity in a language which was too close for comfort. And moreover, very soon, it converted what was the locus of activity of classical Christian civilization, namely the Mediterranean world, into what Wellhausen, the famous German historian of the Islamic world, called an Arabic lake, namely posed geopolitical threats to Europe from the very beginning of this new religion, from the 50 years after the rise of Islam in Arabia. And it remained during the whole formative period of Western civilization as the significant other, this new term which Americans have invented now, the significant other, also has certain historical connotations, namely the only other world that Christianity knew. It is of the utmost significance for the understanding of the Christian attitude and image of Islam in the early period, one which has lasted right down to the 1993 bombing of the New York World Trade Center, where the person who was caught was not called a Jordanian has been called, or a foreigner has been called, but a Muslim has been caught. Whereas one would never say if someone is caught in the mafia, a Catholic has just been caught in New York or something like that. It lasts right into our own day to what is going on today, and therefore it's very significant to understand. Christianity never encountered the Hindu world directly, nor that of Black Africa, nor that, of course, of the Far East or other major Asian or African civilizations. The only other that it knew, the only non-Christian world that it knew, was that of Islam. During this long period, which in fact is the first period which I want to consider, The image of Islam in the West was determined totally by, first of all, the theological relation of Islam to Christianity, that it was not totally alien, but was significantly related to Christianity, and secondly, its geopolitical situation vis-a-vis the Christian West, namely that Western Christianity felt totally threatened by the very existence of Islamic civilization. This period takes us from the rise of Islam to a very symbolic and significant year. We just use it for convenience. Let's choose 1492, the year in which not only Columbus discovered America with the help of Islamic astronomical and geographical instruments and certain Muslim sailors, but also, even more significantly for Muslims and Jews, these two communities were defeated and expelled from Spain. That is, there was the last Muslim kingdom of Granada, which was defeated in 1492, and that year therefore symbolically marks, let's say, the end of, quotes unquote, the Middle Ages in the West, the turning of the West to the New World, and also the turning of the West against its own medieval past. Not only its Christian past to a large extent, the forgetting of scholasticism, of the medieval tradition, but of course more so even against Islamic past. Then we enter a second period, which is that of around the year 1500, let's say the beginning of the modern period, the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Age of Expansion, to the 19th century. The 19th century, the centuries of the expansion of Europe without any serious study of the Islamic world, but the period of the gradual formulation of the romantic, quotes unquote, exotic and Orientalist vision of the Islamic world, which then leads us to the third period, from the middle of 19th century, when you have the serious scholarly study of the Islamic world coming into play in Germany and France and England and later on in other European countries, and the rise of modern scholarship on the Islamic world and the creation of the modern image. Let me briefly deal with these three periods, and let me start with the first one, which lasts the longest, and I believe it is the most significant by far, because you could not find two people as different from each other than, let's say, Karl Marx and St. Thomas Aquinas. And if you were going to say what is the common element between them, it would be their attitude towards Islam. Interestingly enough, there is a theological, religious attitude, even when the West turned against its own theological foundations. And therefore, this early period of several centuries, of 7-8 centuries of human history, is by far the most significant, despite the fact that people now speak in a kind of negative manner about the word medieval and the Middle Ages, and many modern human beings in the West no longer consider themselves to be related to that medieval world. These things are too profound to be changed so easily by the accidents of history and transient fads of thought which have come and gone in the Western world in the last century or two. Now, the origin of the Islamic image in the West in this first period is from the East itself. Interestingly enough, it begins with a great Christian theologian, John the Damascene, who lived in Damascus and who wrote right in the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, the most powerful, without doubt, political unit on the surface of the earth at that time against Islam. He wrote a book in Greek against Islam. And this itself is quite telling, because the image that was projected of Islam in the West, which has survived right to our own day as being a religion of the sword and so forth and so on, although the Crusades were not begun by the Muslims but by the Cluny monks in France, that is usually forgotten. But the fact that John the Damascene lived in Damascus is itself very telling. He participated right under the nose of the Caliph in religious debates with Muslims, and being an outstanding theologian that he was oftentimes won the theological debates, because at that time Islam had not formulated its theology completely and did not have the rational and philosophical tools which a theologian of the level of John the Damascene after 7 centuries of Christian theology had possessed. Anyway, he wrote a book in Greek against Islam, repudiating Islam as a heresy, as a Christian heresy. Not what it was in itself, but in terms of a Christian heresy. This book very rapidly reached the West, and in the history of Bede, the Reverend Bede, who lived around the year 800, the Saracens, in fact, which is the medieval name for the Muslims, appear simply as rudimentary unbelievers and heretics from the Christian point of view. Let me just add here for your general information that in the European Middle Ages, The Muslims were called by two other names. The word Muslim, in fact, was not used at all, besides the name Muhammadan that was used occasionally in its Latin form. Either the word Moor, which comes from the word Mauritania, and appears in English in, for example, Othello's Moor, Iago, in the great Shakespearean play Othello, or Saracen, about which scholars have debated for centuries where the word comes from. Most likely from the word Syria. But nobody knows exactly. There are other candidates for the theory of its origin, but we shall skip that. Anyway, the word Saracen, Saracenic, simply meant Muslim. And the West always understood, also saw the Islamic world in terms of Arab. That is, it commingled the two terms, and does so to this very day, still in the general consciousness of Europeans and Americans with all the education that they've had. When you think of Muslim, the other non-Arabic part of the Islamic world is not in the total picture. And that is one of the reasons why 500 million people on the surface of the earth who are Asian Muslims are never studied in American universities, or hardly ever. They don't figure. The largest religious group in the world which do not figure on the, you might say, the television mindset or the screen of Western consciousness of world culture. You never think, when you don't think of 180 million Muslims in the Malay world, or over 100 million Bengalis. When you talk about the Islamic world, there's no awareness of that. That goes back precisely to the history of bead, written 1,200 years ago. And this goes to show how profound, in fact, these elements are, and how rarely forgotten, how difficult to change. Anyway, before the rise of the Carolingian Empire in Europe, many people began to consider, in the early 9th century, Islam to be a final preparation for the appearance of the Antichrist and the second coming of Christ. And a new element entered into the European awareness of Islam as representing the force of the Antichrist, as being the force against religion. It was too close to comfort, and it was not just a group of unbelievers. There were unbelievers in Africa and other places. People had known that in Europe, even that there are people way out there in Africa who do not believe in Christianity. But the idea that this was not only non-religion, but anti-religion, the figure of the Antichrist became very prevalent, and this element remained whenever in Europe there was, in fact, a weakening of the political or cultural situation. Again, therefore, with the weakening of the Carolingian Renaissance in Europe, gradually this idea comes back, and we see the rise in France in the 11th century. I wish I had time to go over all the details of this. I do not. In the 11th century, of a new genre of writing, which has also left its imprint to the very present day in the Western image of Islam. And that is the writing of biographies against the Prophet, sometimes in Latin poetry, sometimes in prose, in the vernacular, in which they thought that the response to Islam, the attack against Islam, could be completed by an attack against the person of the Prophet. I always say jokingly to my students that God saved the Islamic world by the fact that the Playboy didn't first come out in Arabic. But before such things appeared in the West, when I was a student just 30, 40 years ago in this country, one of the arguments that was quite prevalent given against Islam was that the Muslims were very lascivious, that the Prophet was very sensuous, that there was no sexual morality among Muslims. And this all came from this 19th century image of Delacroix and these paintings which you may have seen of harem scenes and Muslims living always with nude women around and that kind of thing. That goes back again to these very old biographies, of which perhaps the oldest, as far as we know, is the Vita Mahometi, written by Emeritus of Mainz, who was a German, in the 11th century. And so you began to get a new genre of treatment of Islam based not on the religion of Islam but on the Prophet of Islam. And this is quite natural because every religion sees the world from the point of view of its own categories, obviously. And since in Christianity it is the sanctity of the person of Christ that is central to the Christian faith, people thought this was the same for Muslims, and by attacking the person of the Prophet they would take care of Islam as a religion. And then of course there were some really outlandish things written about the Prophet, some of it very crude, some of it outrageous, and it's very symbolic that this type of literature should now be discovered after 900 years by Muslims who were impervious to it as a result of the continuation of this literature by an Indian Muslim lost in the streets of East London. namely Salman Rushdie. That is one of the great paradoxes of our day. It's in fact the Salman Rushdie affair that has led many Muslims who had never thought about these things to go back to these early sources and become very angry, whereas in fact they should understand perfectly well that Emeritus Minds had a lot more right to write about such a thing from his point of view than some modern author who has no excuse whatsoever because he thinks he's operating from the point of view of a secular and non-religious civilization. Anyway, at that time also in the 11th century, it was felt that it was necessary to translate the Quran into Latin. And this was done by Robert of Keaton under the direction of Peter the Venerable, one of the most influential medieval Christian figures, and we have the famous Latin translation of the Quran, which was written by the purpose of refuting and repudiating the arguments of the Quran. That remained the major text for the study of the Quran for centuries until the 15th century when John of Segovia translated it again. And it was at that time that more theological rebuttals against the Islamic tradition came to the fore for the first time in Europe. And from that time on, from the 12th century until the 15th century, you have at once these popular biographies against the Prophet, which continue, and more theological, philosophical discourses against the image of Islam as a religion up to the 15th century. And one of the most interesting things at this time in this early Islamic understanding of Western understanding of Islam is that whenever a Western figure appeared who wanted to criticize the existing church and its authority, it would make use of Islam. For example, Joachim of Flora, the famous Italian visionary, whom all of you know, anyone who's taken a course on Western history knows his significance in the 13th century. He attacked Islam. After attacking, he said, but Islam is now in the person of the Pope in Rome. That is, identifying all that people did not like, criticizing the Christian tradition with Islam itself. And we have the same view of John Wycliffe, who in the 14th century attacked the existing situation of Christianity by saying that it was like Islam. And Islam became, in fact, a yardstick for certain so-called reformers, or at least critics of what is now known as the Catholic tradition, but at that time was the whole of the Western Christian tradition, before the rise of Protestantism, of criticizing that tradition and of religion itself. This period ends on a rather peculiar note. That is, at the very end of the classical Middle Ages, two important figures appear who begin to take the challenge of Islam much more seriously. I will just mention the name. One is this Spaniard, John of Segovia, who began to criticize the earlier translation of the Quran into Latin, claiming, in fact, that it was too full of European images and European concepts, Latin concepts, and that one should really understand the Quran on its own terms. Of course, he did not realize that any translation implies also the using of concepts into which you're translating. But nevertheless, John of Segovia posed a central question, which in fact is the most central question for any discourse between the West and the Islamic world, that is, especially the Christian element that still remains in the West, and that is Islam the word of God or not? Is it a revelation or not? Everything else is diplomacy or convenience. But from a theological point of view, that was the central question, which John of Segovia at least expressed, although of course he did not accept Islam as a revelation from God, which would have posed many serious problems for him as a Christian theologian. That problem being so severe that even now the Catholic Church has a great deal of trouble accepting this openly, despite all the hand of friendship that has been extended in the last few decades to Islam. And when a Christian theologian like Hans Kung takes one step to try to have a closer understanding of Islam, at least to accept that Islam is the word of God, it is oftentimes in opposition to the mainstream of Catholic theology. It's a difficult problem. I'm not saying it's easy, but John of Segovia did not solve it and has not been solved even now. The second important figure was Nicholas of Cusa, who was perhaps the most interesting of all figures who still belong to the classical, traditional world of medieval Christianity, a cardinal of the church, who in fact traveled to Istanbul and who wrote a book on monotheism, in which for the first time, seriously in a theological manner, he accepted Islam as a monotheistic religion. He spoke about the three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And that would have been a major theological breakthrough, save for the fact that Nicholas of Cusa came at the end of a whole world, you might say. Because that medieval scholastic world was falling apart at that time anyway. But nevertheless, the appearance of these two figures is quite significant. Let me summarize this period by saying that, although if we had time, I wanted to say a lot more about this, but it's a short lecture. I have just to mention only the most salient features. That in this long period, paradoxically enough, parallel with the writings of these horrendous biographies against the Prophet and so forth, Western Christianity also held respect for Islam in a way which has never done since, including modern times. The situation of Western Christianity vis-a-vis Islam and downgrading. The greatest thinkers of the Christian West wanted to learn from Islam. Arabic began to be taught, well, in Spain itself it was of course taught from the beginning of the Islamic period, but in France and England from the 12th century onward, the Oxford Chair of Arabic goes back to the 13th century. People wanted to learn Arabic and even put themselves in danger of going into the Arab world, like Raymond Lull, who put himself into mortal danger because he wanted to learn Arabic. And even Roger Bacon said we have to learn Arabic, and through it Islamic learning, what he called Arabic philosophy, in order to expand Christianity, in order to expand the horizons of Christianity. To that extent was this relationship powerful. One should spend a lot more time, because it also concerns the relationship between the West and the Islamic world today, to understand once again what this relationship really was. It was much, much more extensive than people would like to admit. People really have to understand medieval European history again seriously. I'm very glad that at your university you have two people, both Professor Brown and Professor Powers, who are, as historians, are working on this subject. But let me just give you a few examples. The Muslim and Jewish writers of Spain, who composed some of the greatest literature composed on the land mass of Europe, are never called European by today's scholarship. They're never called European writers. They're not part of medieval European literature. And that's just one sentence is enough to show you what is going on. That is this medieval view of Islam as the other, how powerful it is to this very day, when people are doing deconstruction and reconstruction and up and down all the time and remaking and remaking various models and images of the past, how persistent, in fact, this view is, that you will never get a book on medieval European literature, from the most famous ones to the more recent ones, in which not only Arabic but also Hebrew poetry is taken into account as European literature. Is not Spain in Europe? Is not Sicily in Europe? If not, where is it? On the one hand, this was the great land of Europe which was reconquered. On the other hand, people who wrote in it are not considered to be, in fact, Europeans. The same with mysticism. There are many histories of European mysticism. You would never dream of having Ibn Gabirol or Ibn Arabi be included as European mystics. I mean, look at the famous books like the Mystici of Elamir Zolla in Italy, perhaps the best book on mysticism written in modern times, and European mysticism. Excellent book. I mean, Zolla is one of the greatest scholars of Italy. I have great respect for him, great admiration. But even he, who understood the significance of Jewish and Islamic mysticism, did not include a chapter in this classical work, which has been rendered into French and other languages. So you could go just across the board. There is a lack of interest in understanding what is obvious, all the way from the establishment of colleges to the coming of astronomy and mathematics, of medicine, of geology, of many other scientific subjects, to pure philosophy, and to what many people consider to be a purely European phenomenon, adab, that is literature, belles-lettres, and what really led to the rise of humanism, although it became a secularized and anthropomorphic humanism in the Renaissance. All of these are related to their Islamic counterpart and Islamic models. I'm not saying that everything European was Islamic. That's absurd. I, for example, claim that the Dante's Divine Comedy is the most Christian poem, and in fact the greatest structure of Western civilization from a literary point of view. But its structure is taken from an Arabic-Persian model, which is perfectly possible. Exactly what Christianity and Islam did vis-a-vis certain Greek ideas. Dionysius the Areopagite is one of the most profound of Christian thinkers. That doesn't mean that he did not take certain models of emanation of various hierarchies from Plotinus. This does not exclude the creative genius of one civilization vis-a-vis another. Islam itself took many Indian or Persian or elements of Syriac and Greek origin and Islamized it. This is exactly what happened in the European Middle Ages, but unfortunately very few people want to pay attention to such simple fact that the word doctorate comes from an Arabic source. The very word doctorate, how to get a doctorate, which is the foundation of higher studies in universities. Fortunately now with the books of George Maqdisi and others, there's such ample material and witness, it's very hard to refute these facts. Anyway, this period of very interesting contact between Christianity and Islam, in which Judaism, especially in Spain, played a very, very important role, which must never be forgotten. This period comes to an end abruptly with the destruction of both the both the Islamic and Jewish communities in Spain, and the rise of a new period of European consciousness. When we say European civilization or any kind of civilization, of course we mean the mainstream. What in the 16th century, at the height of, in fact, after the height of the European Renaissance, just before the age of Enlightenment began, there was a new translation of the writings of Averroes into Latin, discovered by the great scholar Harry Wolfson, called in his famous essay, The Twice Revealed Averroes, at least made known. It was the translation was known, but he made it a commonly known fact. Now, no one wants to negate that, but that was a peripheral phenomenon. That was going on in Bologna and Padua, whereas the central activity of European civilization was not in Bologna and Padua. It was actually in Germany, France, England, and these Italian universities were no longer in the mainstream of European intellectual life. So when I say make comments now, I do not mean what was going on in a few corner places, or the continuation of the teaching of Ibn Sina in University of Lima in Peru in the 17th century. There was a great deal of interest in Lima, Peru, in the university established by the Catholics, which is one of the oldest universities in the New World. But who in this room has ever heard of the philosophy department of the University of Lima in the 17th century? Nobody. It has nothing to do with what Western civilization has a consciousness of, what led to Descartes and Wolff and Malebranche and Leibniz and Kant and other great Western philosophers, and what created the Western mindset in the 17th and 18th centuries actually was based not only on a rejection of the medieval European past, but also, of course, of Islam even more so. This second period, the period from, let's say, around 1500 to the 19th century, is therefore a period of at once a hatred of Islam and also a sense of superiority vis-a-vis Islam, especially as time wore out in the latter part of this period, which did not exist in the European Middle Ages. The European Middle Ages was intellectually very much interested in Islam and looked upon it sometimes even with an air of superiority vis-a-vis itself, that is to learn something from it, otherwise as equals, as cousins who are against each other, brothers who are against each other, but not as conqueror and conquered. Whereas the second period, which begins with the Portuguese conquest of the economic underbelly of the Islamic world, namely the Indian Ocean, followed by the Dutch and the British, and therefore the destruction of the economic unity of the Islamic world, which is an extremely significant fact, which Muslims remain unaware of for a long time and for which they're paying now, actually, in the last 2 centuries, ends with the almost total dominion, that is physical domination, of the Islamic world by the West. And as this domination continues, the older image of Islam as another civilization, which is of value, and a religion which is strangely not produces great art and great science and great poetry and the like, but which is false, which is a heresy, in fact, it changes completely. The hatred continues. But with it comes, first of all, the sense of the superiority of the European over the rest of the globe. That is, the new European now freed from his bond to heaven in a certain sense, that is no longer feeling himself totally bound to heaven, begins to conquer the earth, begins to develop a science which is based on a dominion of the earth rather than harmony with the earth, and of course develops a military technology which is able to conquer most of the earth. It is interesting that during this period, very few areas of the world are able to resist, in fact, the expansion of the West. And among these, besides Japan, which was never captured by the West, is parts of the Islamic world. Because this part of history is marked by the presence of the Ottomans. The Ottomans pose once again a military danger for Europe, which many people forget. When we think of history, we forget that it was only in 1638, that in the 17th century, that Vienna almost fell to the hands of the Ottomans. And in fact, the place on top of the hill where the Ottoman military officers conducted the campaign against Vienna, you can just look right down and see St. Stephen's Cathedral, and the whole of the city of Vienna underneath is now a famous restaurant. They were that close, looking directly down upon the city. That remarkable closeness of the Ottoman presence and the danger which people felt it posed for European civilization at that time was, however, very different from the situation of Spain and Sicily, very different from the battles of the Crusades in which the West invaded the Islamic world. It was very, very different from that. There was no intellectual give and take. Intellectual give and take does not only come from contiguity, it comes from receptivity. That is, a civilization has to be able to receive something in order to receive something. And another civilization has to be able to give something in order to give something. This simple fact is oftentimes forgotten. The British ruled over India for 300 years, at the end of which not even 0.5% of India became Christian. Just this fact, with all the money spent, all of the Anglo missionary colleges which still survive over the whole of the continent, and all the advantages that accrue to learning English and learning something about the Bible and so forth, the British civilization at that time was not able to give Christianity to India, either a Muslim India or Hindu India, nor was that civilization ready to receive it. So you always need this element of both possibility of giving and of receiving. Simply the fact that two civilizations are next to each other doesn't mean that one is going to necessarily influence the other. Now, what happened with the Ottoman world is very interesting from the point of view, again, of what is going on today. The massacre of all these human beings in Bosnia, which is called ethnic cleansing, which has absolutely nothing to do with ethnicity, it has to do with religion. Because these people are Slavs, they have blue eyes, they speak exactly the same language as Serbs and Croats, but they're called Muslims, and the other two are not called Orthodox and Catholics. Again, part of this remarkable treatment of subjects that our world is witness to, supposedly in the age of objectivity and of science and of rationality. This goes back very much to this second period. Europe saw not in the Ottomans, not the heirs to Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and Al-Khwarizmi and so forth and so on, and the great Muslim scientists and philosophers, or the origin of Arabic adab, which writers in Sicily were interested in the 13th century, or authors of remarkable Quranic illuminations, which Westerners copied so much they would even do pseudo-Arabic epigraphy on the mantle of the Virgin. That's not what the Ottomans represented to Europe, but it represented a kind of frivolous, shallow, but at the same time powerful military civilization, all of which is summarized in, let's say, Mozart opera Abduction of the Seraglio. That's what the Ottoman world represented, or a little Turkish march or something like that. What came from the Ottoman world to the West at this time were these cupolas and tops of Eastern churches, which still survive, which originally come from Ottoman Islamic art, and a few Turkish suites, and one or two astronomical instruments called the Torquem and things like that, which are hardly known to the general public. And much more than that, an idea of, as I said, the harem and sexuality and ruthlessness of the armies, and all of these amalgamated together without I would not say any, but without any significant intellectual or spiritual, especially religious interaction between Europe and the Ottoman world. There were individual Europeans who would come to the Sublime Porte, and a few of them even became Muslims or remained as Jewish or Christian advisors to the Sultan. We have examples of that. Very few of you perhaps know that one of the most beautiful mosques in Cairo, built during the Ottoman period, the Rifa'i Mosque in Cairo, was built actually by an Austrian Jew who was an advisor to the Muslim architect. At the end of his life, he embraced Islam, but when he was advisor, he in fact was practicing Judaism, had come from Europe, was working with the Ottoman rulers, and helped to create that incredibly beautiful mosque which is next to the Sultan Hassan Mosque. I don't think anybody in this room, unless you're architectural historians, has ever thought of this fact, but that's the way the fact was. But there was not another Dante in Europe who would take some element of Ottoman poetry or thought or some writing of, let's say, Jalaluddin Rumi, who originally wrote in Persian, but was translated into Turkish, and would become interested in it intellectually. During this longer period, it was really the mavericks of European thought who were interested in Islam. Again, like what had happened with John Wycliffe. For example, Voltaire. Voltaire, who is known for his attacks against Christianity and being so-called a free thinker, was interested in Islam. But he saw in Islam as a kind of anti-fideist, an anti-religious, rational way of looking at things, and wanted to hit Christianity on the head with the help of Islam. That's why he was interested in Islam. You get this attitude all the way into the 19th century to Ernst Renan. Ernst Renan, who wrote a letter against the Muslims' ability to think, and sent it to Jamaluddin al-Afghani in his book Averroes and Averroism, Averroes et l'Averroisme, which is one of the classical works of 19th century European scholarship on Islamic thought, and the sort of beginning of modern interest in Islamic thought, says there explicitly that his interest in Averroism is precisely that Averroism was the rational response to all of what he opposed, the fideist and complicated theological reasoning of the medieval church. So in this next 350 years, which covers the age of expansion, the European image of Islam continues the same old hatred, with now a sense of superiority, which is marked by Napoleon's, in fact, attitude, although he was interested in Islam, when he invaded and defeated the army of the Khalif outside of Cairo near the pyramids, and which appears in a great deal of European literature, and which has left its imprint upon a great deal of the Spanish world's attitude to Islam to this very day. When the Cathedral of Guatemala was built in the 17th century, the cathedral which still stands, if you go inside this cathedral and look at the ceiling, you think you're in a mosque in Cairo or in Damascus. The artwork is purely Islamic. And if you study it, you'll find out they were almost completely built by Muslims. And we have this document that the people in Guatemala went to the bishop and said, how is it you allow these Muslims to build a cathedral? And the bishop said, don't worry, they have the works, but we have the faith. This is a very interesting attitude which, in fact, has now totally disappeared south of the border here and in the Spanish and Portuguese worlds, because they, in a sense, lived with this Islamic past somewhat more than the rest of Europe, and also survived to a large extent in southern Italy, which had a long period of close physical contiguity with Islam. Now this brings me, and my time, in fact, is almost over, but to the modern period, with which I have to conclude. The 19th century, the middle of 19th century, is marked by two very important events as far as the image of Islam in the West is concerned. One is very positive, one is very negative, and they go parallel with each other. First of all, let me say at the outset, I am not one of those Muslim scholars who takes to task all that Western scholarship has done about the Islamic world. I do not agree with all the theses, although very brilliant, of Edward Said in his book Orientalism, although I think every educated American should read that book, because some of it is true. But that excessive and extreme form of considering all scholarship to be motivated like that, I do not accept, and I speak as a Muslim scholar. But nevertheless, there are very profound criticisms of the Western scholarship of Islam, which I have to mention as I see it, which certainly, whether you take it positively or negatively, have influenced the image of Islam in the West today. But as I was saying, there were two parallel events that took place, one of which was based on a positive, much more positive understanding of Islam and the image of Islam, and one a new phase in the negative treatment of Islam. Let me start with the positive. The Romantic movement in Europe in the 19th century created a nostalgia in Europe for the world of the sacred, for something which the Age of Enlightenment, so-called, the Age of Reason, and the humanistic scientism of the 17th century had destroyed. And you all know how that manifested itself in the revival of Gothic art in the West, renewal of interest in medieval European poetry, in Dante, the new translations, and all of those things which everybody who's studied the Romantic period knows. But it also had an Islamic component. It's at this time that some of the greatest European minds, I mean really the greatest, among the greatest, became seriously interested for the first time after 500-600 years in Islamic literature mostly, rather than theology, as the vehicle for the expression of another worldview for which they had a nostalgia. Chief among these, of course, is Goethe, the greatest of all poets of the German language, or one of the two greatest, who, during several years at the end of his life, encompassing the beginning of the 19th century until his death, because he wrote this work over a 10-year period, wrote his East-West Diwan, which was his response to the Diwan of Hafez, the greatest poet of the Persian language. In fact, it was not only known in Persia, but in India, and in fact, Hafez became famous in the West first through its importance in India. There was no Indian Muslim home in the 19th century which, besides the Quran, did not have a Diwan of Hafez, and many of them still have it. And that came into Germany. It was translation into German, made by a number of important Austrian and German scholars, like Hammer von Purgstall, and Rückert, of course, the great German poet, who was at once an Arabist, Persianist, and German poet. And you began to get in the 19th century in Germany, soon followed in England, and even America, in figures like Emerson, who were very much tuned in, as they say today, to what was going on in Germany at that time, with New England Transcendentalism just a few miles down the road from here, the Persians of Cambridge in the mid-19th century, who write in Harvard Square, were reading very avidly the poetry of Sa'di and of Rumi and of Hafez and Khayyam, and the rise, of course, of the Fitzgerald translation of Khayyam somewhat later in Europe, which, however, was very much misunderstood, but nevertheless marked this nostalgia for another world outside of the Victorian straitjacket world of late 19th century England. All of this, which is a vast and very interesting subject, marks the beginning of an appreciation of an aspect of Islamic civilization which the earlier period had remained totally impervious to. And some of the most positive images of Islam come out of this particular movement, which begins in the 19th century and which has not totally died out. Today, for example, one of the most influential and significant of all Western scholars of Islam, Anna Maria Schimmel, who is a German, who just retired from Harvard University and went back to Germany this year, really represents a continuation of the school. If you really analyze her, especially her German poetry, because she's also a poetess in German, or poet in German, I'm afraid, with this new change in language in English, to be careful what language I use, and has not totally died out by any means. Parallel with that, there began the application of a so-called scientific methodology of the study of religion, which was based on the one hand on philology, on the other hand on historicism, to Islam. And this did not begin with Islam, and Muslims should not complain that this was all invented for them. They should not have these false phobias. It was even applied to Christianity. It was applied to Judaism. That is a way to repudiate, in essentially, the sacred character of sacred history. And this was begun, as I said, by being applied to both Judaism and Christianity, and later on applied to Islam, based on meticulous scholarship of a historical kind, the study of Semitic philology, and later on Iranian philology by Yusti and others in Germany, and the establishment of the foundations of what we call Islamic studies in a scientific sense in the West, or what is called Orientalism. Because until the 1930s and 1940s, Islamic studies was part of Orientalism. Princeton University was still at the part of Oriental studies until a few decades ago. Professor Young tried to change it 30 years ago. Now, this Orientalism was based on the idea, but we think about it, it sounds very funny, but it was really survived right into our own day, that first of all, so-called Orientals, that is people of the East, really don't know much about their own religion. They don't know what they're talking about. It is we who have this new method of studying and should tell them what their religion is all about. I must tell you this story, which is really incredible. 30 years ago, the International Association for the History of Religion held its first meeting in America. It was always held in Europe. It was held in Claremont College in Claremont, California, which has a major school of theology. And I was invited, came all the way from Tehran at that time to participate, to give one of the major lectures. And Prince Mikasa, the brother of the Emperor of Japan, was there with a 90-man delegation, men and women, large delegation from Japan, who were the greatest Buddhist scholars of Japan. And a man whose name I will not mention, but was one of the leading scholars of religion from Holland, who was then the Secretary General of the International Association for the History of Religions. Wiedengren was then the president, the great Swedish scholar of religion, got up and said in front of these 90 people that there is no one in the East, especially in Japan and China, who knows anything about Buddhism to teach us. You know, he said that in front of these people, and his brother, Emperor of Japan, sat very politely and looked at him. And he went on and rambled along, and it was to his credit, Professor Wilfred Cantwell Smith, later on of Harvard University, a Canadian professor who was tried, in fact, to change the scene in America, who got up and said, "What are you talking about? What we know about Buddhism is just one iota compared to these people who've lived it their whole life." But this attitude survived right into our own day and has not died out by any means. There's a whole school in England established by modern scholars who think they know the Quran much better than Muslims, and who in fact can explain the Quran by explaining it away. I mean, this begins with Nöldeke, but it's based on the premise that the Quran is not the Word of God. Not being the Word of God, now let's try to understand how it got these stories of Moses mixed up, and why it said the wrong things about Christ, and so forth and so on, and what are these Ethiopic terms doing in the Quran, and all this scholarship that goes on in the name of Quranic studies. Now, this kind of scholarship was at least very scholarly from the point of view of its approach, and it brought many great works into the light of day, made the translation and the printing of important Arabic and Persian texts possible. You have to give credit where credit is due. Still today in the Islamic world itself, if people can find the old 19th century edition of Dossassi or someone like that in France, they'll buy that any day, because the Arabic is so beautifully printed and so well done. But along with it came this idea that in fact Muslims, along with Hindus and Buddhists and others, didn't really know what they were talking about, and we have to teach them about their own religion. Now, this attitude was abetted by two factors. On the one hand, the missionaries who made use of this kind of a scholarship, of course, to convert others. It still goes on in certain places like Indonesia and certain parts of Africa. And on the other hand, the colonial administrators who had to learn things about the people that they're administering. It is this which in fact was the original impetus, the reason why universities gave money in France and England for this kind of scholarship. And it was not, however, all. It is true that the most detailed book on the Sufi orders in North Africa by Reims was written by a member of the French secret police. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that the translations of the Akhlaq al-Jalali in India was by the order of the British Viceroy, so as to know what the Muslims thought. That's why we have a 19th century translation of the Akhlaq al-Jalali of Jalaluddin Dawani, which we don't have in the 20th century. That's true. But a lot of this scholarship was also based on the very objective attitude of European scholars, who could not get out of the mold of the positivism, historicism of their time, but nevertheless they were honest scholars. It isn't that all Orientalists were at the service of foreign officers. Many exceptions, and speaking scholars like Gibb, I'm talking about the older generation and living people, and who produced, in fact, scholarship of the first order, who did accept Islam as a revelation, who in fact wanted to create a better image of Islam in the West to bring about better understanding. Their chore should not be totally overlooked in the new embittered period that unfortunately we are now entering in the relationship between the West and the Islamic world, especially with the fall of the communist world and the machinations that are going on, which mark the present period. One should be honest before the face of God and not to judge always black and white. There were these very great scholars who also thought that they would act as bridge between the Islamic world and the West at a time when it was very difficult to do so. Louis Massignon, the greatest of all French Orientalists who ever lived, was taken by the French right, had his hands tied up and thrown into the Seine River. When he was about 70 years old, he almost drowned. He almost put his life down for the fact that he was trying to bring understanding between the Algerians and the French in those crucial days of the late 50s, early 60s, the Algerian War. So there were many instances of this kind. Now, my time is almost up, and I have to conclude to give you a chance to ask some questions. What has happened in the last few years is, I believe, the most colossal tragedy of all. And that is that, unfortunately, for the image of Islam in the West and Western Islamic understanding, the Islamic world had three things which the West wanted crucially. One of them is gone, two of them remain. One is, of course, what occurred during the Cold War, of the use of the Islamic world in being a bulwark against the spread of communism further south, the role of Turkey and Iran, especially as the frontier states, and Pakistan to some extent a bit more to the east, with all that meant as far as the image of Islam in the West was concerned. And secondly was, of course, the crucial and central Arab-Israeli question and the question of land. Who owns the land in the Holy Land? Which is, of course, has not been solved and is one of the most tragic questions which unfortunately overshadows practically everything else. And the third, the question of oil, the need of getting cheap energy, which the tragic war of 1990, the Persian Gulf War, solved perhaps for many years. The West will now have its cheap oil for a long time to come, but it will have to pay a very heavy price elsewhere. Things do not come by that cheap. 400,000 people died vis-a-vis 365 or whatever it was, and the destruction of the infrastructure of a whole country is not going to be that easy to swallow. It's going to have its repercussions in Turkey, in Iran, elsewhere for a long, long time to come, and in Saudi Arabia itself, which is a major bastion of American influence. But nevertheless, all of these elements have led, unfortunately, to the present-day situation in which you have very complicated forces at play. First of all, you have to sell arms. Let's be very honest. You cannot undo the arms industry so quickly. And many people are very happy, very, very happy, that you have bombings and all kind of terrible things going on, and local wars are wonderful. The Iran-Iraqi war brought $200 billion to the Western industries, arms industries, and other industries related to it. And these are very hard economic facts. And although everybody saw how terrible, it wasn't terrible for some people. And the Middle East is a very good candidate, much better than, let's say, what's going on in Burma, where Muslims are being massacred and nobody says anything, and who cares what's going on in Buddhist Burma. It's not, again, on the screen of consciousness of Westerners, but the Middle East is under the microscope. On the one hand, there is this interest in preserving and continuing to sell arms. Secondly is the question of cheap energy, because if in these countries there were to be governments which are not the remnants of, in not all cases, in many cases, of the colonial powers that left 50 years ago, that would only think of the welfare of their own people, of course there would be a lot of repercussions as far as the price of oil and gas and things like that are concerned. So this is on one side. On the other side, you have an element within the Islamic world which itself helps to tarnish the image of Islam in the West. There's no doubt about it. It's not a two-way thing. It is on the one hand that of all the major non-Western civilizations, not only religions, Islam is the only civilization which has chosen to follow its own way. That's a very, very crucial fact to understand. And that the modern so-called world order, which is the Western world order, at least what President Bush thought it was going to be imposed upon the globe, finds an opposition. And therefore, even if the other side says, I'm not opposed to you, I just want to be myself, the first side says, no, you're opposed to me by the very fact that you want to be yourself. And it's this fact which is not going to go away. It's a major tension within the Islamic world. No matter what kind of government comes to power, whoever is ruling in, let's say, Ankara or Cairo or Tunis is going to be faced with this fact. And pretty soon you're going to have in the Islamic world a situation in which you will have the vast majority of people wanting to follow not only Islam as a religion for Friday noon, but for the whole week. And governments which will act somewhat like colonial governments in the 19th century, except they have the name of Ahmed and Hassan and Parviz and something like that, the local Arabic, Persian, Turkish names. And as a result of this, since the mass of the population sees these governments as being supported by the West, they are going to have more and more acts of violence, unfortunately, unless normal processes for the expression of the political will of the people is allowed. And since that is not allowed, and since the great paradox is that America, which always speaks about democracy, does not have much interest in democracy in the Islamic world, to just put it mildly, so see what has happened in the last few years, and nobody is unaware of this fact in the cafes of Istanbul or Cairo. You can also be sure of that. I've visited both of these countries in the last few months. Because of this, unfortunately, terrible acts are committed, which are then committed in the names of Islam, in the name of Islam, and the whole question of terrorism, of the throwing of bombs, which plays right into the hand of those which would precisely love to make the Islamic world appear to be what it appeared to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. a great danger encompassing civilization and about to destroy it, and must act as guardians of civilization and ward off these barbarians. That's why all of these old images come up again. Islam is considered to be a religion of the sword. I mean, what sword? It was like the Iraqi army, which was supposed to be the fourth most powerful army in the world. I mean, we kept hearing that every day on the American television, which was then squashed in 24 hours. I kept saying, what about the French army, the English army, the 1 million man Indian army, the Chinese army, the Russian army, the Brazilian army? What happened to those? Nothing counted. This was the fourth greatest army in the world. You must have all heard this 3 years ago. You were all surprised how, in fact, you don't have 1, 2, 3, 4. You must have 1, then 93, 94, 95 as far as the rankings are concerned, because there was no comparison. This image is coming up all the time of a powerful Islam taking over the world, whereas all it wants to do is to be itself. And then the idea that Islam is against the West and is against America, which is precisely that kind of feeling plays into. And that is a very complicated matter into which I can not really enter now. And I simply have to conclude by saying that we live at a very tragic moment in human history, when after the fall of the Soviet Union, of really the great heresy of both Christianity and Judaism, which was created, in fact, by a non-believing and atheistic Jew living within a secularized German society in the 19th century, that is Karl Marx. With the falling apart of that, and the possibility of the rise of religious accord between the three sister or brother religions, the monotheistic religions, which would have the deepest effect upon the rest of the world, at such a time, very quickly now, something has to fill this vacuum of the enemy. And in fact, people are now much less scared of Boris Yeltsin or of the Russian parliament than they are of the Pakistani bomb or something like that, where the number of hydrogen bombs that Moscow itself still has would put all of the Pakistani arms into total insignificance, of course. But it's the image that is created at this very moment, the exasperation, the fact that there is no outlet within much of the Islamic world for the normal processes of society to express in a dynamic way its feelings, its beliefs, its needs, have lent themselves to a situation in which now the media comes in, and the media plays a very, very important role in now molding the new image, in which, as I said, I've just mentioned 2 instances for you. 3, unfortunately, brotherly groups and sisterly groups who lived for a long, long time at peace with each other. In fact, they weren't always killing each other. Sarajevo was a major center of religious accord, and one of them are killing the other 2, and it always appears that they're all killing off each other. And secondly, one of them is called by its religious name, and the other 2 are never called by their religious name. Or a Waco comes out in Waco, Texas, is not called a Christian messianic figure who in fact is a Christian, the minister of the Christian church, but who's gone off the deep end. But some Jordanian who puts a bomb is immediately a Muslim bomb thrower. And the argument given that these people identify themselves with Islam, of course, is meaningless, because the whole war in Ireland is between Protestants and Catholics. But you never hear about Catholic bombing and Protestant bombing. There are other appellations that are created. All of this is preserved for the mass media for one single religion, one single civilization, which is Islam. And this is very tragic, both for the Islamic world, for the West, and for the accord between them. And that is why this deeper study of the question of the images of Islam in the West, very far from being simply of academic interest, which they are also of very crucial interest for where we are now and where we shall go in the future. Thank you.